My name is Ethan Miller, and I spent my whole life believing I could build a comfortable version of myself, a version that hid who I really was. I told myself I was just the driver, the guy who organized the routes, calculated schedules, and studied the patterns of the families that would be raided. I kept telling myself I wasn't responsible for any of it because I didn't hold the gun, didn't threaten anyone directly, much less pull the trigger. The lie started small, as an acceptable justification for a conscience that was still trying to breathe, but it grew so strong that it became a kind of emotional armor where I convinced myself that by not engaging in violence, I wasn't producing it. The problem is that when you insist on a lie for too long, it ceases to be an escape and becomes your identity. When I received the first invitation, I hesitated. When the second came, I rationalized. And when the third arrived, I accepted, shifting the blame to a need I claimed was financial, even knowing that what truly attracted me wasn't the money, but the intoxicating feeling of power that arose when I realized that those strong, armed, and feared people needed me to execute each plan. With each successful operation, I felt less human and more strategic, as if I were playing a silent game where each move made me more useful to the group and, at the same time, further removed from any trace of empathy. Over time, I began to feel irreplaceable. I studied houses, routines, schedules. I knew the victims' lives better than they did themselves, and the more I observed, the more I realized that controlling that information gave me a power I had never experienced. Evil didn't seduce me with explicit violence. It seduced me with the idea that I was too intelligent to get my hands dirty, that I could participate without participating, reap without sowing, destroy without feeling guilty. And so, what began as a deviation transformed into a lifestyle, and I didn't realize I was descending a ladder that only led downwards. If I had seen the price tag sooner, perhaps I would have backed down. But when your conscience falls asleep, the abyss becomes comfortable, until the day everything collapses at once. And that's exactly what happened to me. If anything so far has made you think, don't leave the video. Subscribe and like to continue following this testimony, because what comes next isn't a story, it's the truth. When I entered the world of crime, I didn't do it out of necessity. I did it for the thrill. It was as if I had discovered a secret door that gave me access to a universe where everything that seemed impossible in my ordinary life was suddenly available. I remember the first luxury car I sat in, the smell of the leather, the sound of the engine, the admiring looks from people when I got out of the vehicle, as if I naturally belonged in that environment, and I didn't realize that it was just makeup for an empty soul. Inside me, there was an old hunger to be seen, to be valued, to be someone, and crime offered me that feeling without questioning the price I would have to pay later. When people asked me what I did, I made up stories, and each lie seemed to reinforce the idea that I was finally in control of something. The money came quickly, so quickly that I began to believe I was too smart to have an ordinary life, as if honest work was a sign of weakness. I frequented places I would never have had access to before. And suddenly, people I admired were asking for my opinion. I thought I was living the high life, as if I had hacked the system. I began to enjoy the adrenaline of risk, that constant tension that everything could go wrong, and at the same time the arrogant certainty that with me it would always work out. The seduction of evil didn't arrive with violence. It arrived with praise, with recognition, with the feeling that I was indispensable. With each new operation, I felt more needed, more respected, and the more I was celebrated among them, the more I distanced myself from who I had been. Money was never just about money. It was external proof that I had inner worth. Over time, I realized I was addicted not to things, but to the feeling of power. I woke up and went to sleep with the same thought: no one can replace me. This is how sin works. First it convinces you that you are in control, then it makes you believe that without it, you are nothing. I no longer saw faces. I saw opportunities. I no longer saw people, I saw targets. Crime didn't just make me cold, it made me blind. And when spiritual blindness sets in, you lose the ability to gauge consequences. What I didn't imagine is that life demands payment for everything, even things you think you've already forgotten. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, have you ever wished for something that seemed like victory, but took you away from who you truly are? Right. Open my eyes, Lord. The first time they agreed to let me participate in a home invasion, they said it would be simple, quick, and risk-free. They said I wouldn't need to go inside, wouldn't need to see anything, wouldn't need to get my hands dirty. All I had to do was watch the street, warn them when the resident left, and ensure the escape route was clear. When I heard that, I felt something strange run through my body, as if a line had been crossed inside me without me realizing it. I looked at the door of that house and felt a chill in my soul, but at the same time, an addictive sensation took over me. It was as if the adrenaline was promising me a life I never had. When the car stopped and everyone got out, I repeated in my mind the phrase that would lull me to sleep that night. I'm just driving. In that first job, I didn't see blood, I didn't hear screams, I didn't witness direct violence. However, I saw something that marked my conscience more than any weapon could. I saw a woman crying while hugging her young. Children begging for no one to hurt them. The door of the house was ajar, and even though I was on the street, I could see the despair etched in her eyes, as if fear had materialized around her body. I could have called the police, I could have given up, I could have run, but I stayed. I did nothing. I remained seated in the car, motionless, trying to stifle the guilt with cheap justifications. When they returned to the car with their belongings in their backpacks and smiles on their faces, I didn't know that a part of me had died there. Something inside me fell silent at that moment, not because I wanted it to, but because I allowed it. When you ignore your conscience once, it begins to speak ever softer, until the day you can no longer hear anything. From that day on, I stopped seeing people. I began to see routines, opportunities, weaknesses. It was as if a switch had been flipped off inside me, and I was functioning on autopilot, obeying sin as if it were an invisible master. The scariest thing is that after that night, I no longer felt guilt. On the contrary, I felt ease. The line that was once a boundary became a passage. My heart hardened, and without realizing it, I began to want more. I became thirsty to feel again that perverse power that only the control of another's life can offer. I no longer needed to convince myself. I believed. What I didn't know was that when consciousness falls silent, the spirit begins to die. And when the spirit dies, you become capable of things you never imagined you could do. And it was this silent death of my soul that led me to the next stage, where coldness ceased to be the exception and became my new normal. After that first crime, I was never the same person again. It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a sudden change. It was a slow and almost imperceptible process, like water seeping through cracks until it rotted everything from the inside. Indifference began as emotional protection, as a mechanism to avoid facing guilt, but it quickly became a way of life. When I realized it, I felt nothing anymore. It was as if every terrified face I saw erased a piece of my humanity, and that emptiness, which initially frightened me, began to become comfortable. The inner silence that was once moral transformed into a deathly silence. I stopped seeing people. I started seeing patterns, addresses, routines. I discovered that, in the world of crime, coldness is a valuable currency, and the less I reacted to screams and tears, the more I was respected. They began to trust me not because I was strong, but because I was incapable of feeling. Empathy is a waste when the goal is to execute a plan without leaving a trace. I analyzed families like one observes objects: who arrived home first, who left later, who was afraid, who was brave. And the more I mapped out weaknesses, the more powerful I felt. I became so accustomed to the pain of others that I could no longer distinguish right from wrong. Entering homes and invading lives became routine, a habit, part of who I was. When a victim screamed begging, I felt only irritation, as if the suffering of others was an inconvenient obstacle that needed to be overcome. I became the kind of person I swore I would never become, a man who not only saw evil happen, but silently authorized it. I believed I was in control, but the deeper I sank, the more I realized that the control I thought I had was just an illusion created by sin to keep me trapped. And the most perverse thing of all is that sin convinced me I was on top, when in reality I was plummeting. Coldness gave me status among criminals, but inside I was slowly decomposing, like a body that remains intact on the outside while rotting on the inside. I no longer dreamed, no longer felt, no longer feared. Evil becomes natural when the spirit loses sensitivity. It was at that point that something inside me began to prepare for the worst, without me even knowing it. Indifference wasn't the end. It was merely the path that led me to the moment when everything would crumble. Because death doesn't come suddenly. It gives signs. It whispers. And on the day that whisper became a scream, I finally saw and felt it. That night began like all the others, shrouded in a deceptive sense of routine and absolute control over every step of the plan we had structured for days. I pored over maps, studied schedules, analyzed street traffic patterns, and when I got into the car to drive to the address, I carried within me the old conviction that nothing could escape my control, because that was precisely what kept me blind to the consequences, the false belief that control protected me. The neighborhood was quiet, a middle-class area with well-kept houses and windows that seemed to sleep, but something stood out from that carefully calculated scene. There was a child's bicycle lying in the yard, with small, colorful wheels that betrayed the presence of a child, and that information should have been enough to make me back down. However, I chose to ignore the silent warning that arose within me, repeating the phrase that had become my emotional shield whenever my conscience threatened to reach me. I'm just driving. I'm not part of the violence. While the others went into the house, I remained in the car, my fingers gripping the steering wheel and my gaze fixed on a partially lit window, and it was there that something inside me broke. A child appeared, clutching a toy to their chest, with a look that mixed fear and innocence. They saw me, and in that instant I felt shame for the first time in years. Immediately afterwards came the sounds I could never forget: objects falling, furniture being dragged, someone pleading for their family's life, and finally the dry crack of a gunshot that nullified any justification I had constructed to deceive myself. When the men came running back and told me to speed up, I tried to react, but the guilt weighed so heavily that my hands felt frozen. The street was dark and wet from the sudden rain, and I tried to stay focused, but on a curve a pickup truck appeared unexpectedly. I tried to swerve, but the car collided with such force that the impact felt like it was tearing me apart inside. There was shattering glass, twisting metal, muffled screams, the metallic taste of blood, and then absolute silence. There was no pain, only the strange sensation of being pulled out of myself, as if my soul were detaching from my body without me being able to stop it. In that instant, I understood something I had never considered. When the heart stops, there is no escape or excuse, only the truth. At the moment of impact, the sound of the collision wasn't just heard, it was felt. It was as if each twisted piece of metal was pulling something inside me, and when the violence of the crash finally subsided, I realized something I had never experienced before. There was no pain, at least not the kind I imagined would come after such a brutal accident. What existed was a strange feeling of lightness, as if the weight of my body had been left behind. Still, I heard the sounds around me with frightening clarity. People running, someone shouting for help, another voice saying my pulse was weak, sirens in the distance growing louder. My brain seemed to pick up everything, but at the same time, nothing seemed to make sense. When I tried to open my eyes, I was overcome by a disconcerting realization. I wasn't inside the car. The first clear image I saw was the shattered windshield, reflecting the red and blue lights of the arriving police cars. I was standing a few meters away from the accident, like a random observer who had arrived later. My first impulse was to approach and help the victim inside, but as I walked, something cold ran through my soul. The victim was me. My body was trapped between the steering wheel and the seat, twisted, my face covered in blood and my eyes half closed, as if I were just sleeping. But the way the paramedics moved betrayed the truth. They worked urgently, pressing on my chest, trying to revive my heart. And the harder they tried, the more I felt I was drifting away from everything. Not physically, but existentially. I tried to speak. I tried to touch the shoulder of one of the paramedics. I tried to shout so they would know I was there, conscious. But no words came out. No sound was produced. And when I tried to touch one of their arms, my hand passed through their body as if it were made of smoke. The sensation wasn't one of transparency. It was one of displacement, as if I occupied a space that no longer belonged to the world I knew. At that moment, understanding began to tear my soul apart from the inside. I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't unconscious. I wasn't in some kind of mental delirium because of the trauma. I was dead, even though my body was still there trying to fight. There was no darkness. There was no tunnel. There was only a shift in perception so profound that my mind simply couldn't resist. It was as if my entire being was being slowly sucked in an invisible direction, a force I couldn't see, but which pulled me with unquestionable firmness. And the more I was pulled, the more distant the voices, the sirens, the sound of tools cutting through metal to get me out of there became. No matter how hard I tried to go back, I no longer had any control over anything. During this journey, I felt that the question I had never asked myself was about to be answered. The question everyone tries to avoid while they are alive. Where does a soul go when the body can no longer hold it? As my spirit was ripped from the accident site, something I couldn't comprehend led me to a kind of space that didn't belong to the physical world. There was no ground, no sky, nor any trace of landscape, only a silent immensity that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions, as if I were traversing successive layers of emptiness. The absence of sound was so absolute that it gave the impression of possessing weight, almost as if the silence were made of matter. Even without a body, I felt something akin to movement, as if I were being carried to a destination beyond my control. In the midst of this indescribable transition, something began to change gradually. The darkness wasn't abruptly replaced by light, as if a switch had been flipped, but emerged in a growing way, until I found myself before a light that couldn't be compared to anything my human eyes had ever seen. That light neither blinded nor hurt, yet as it enveloped me, it revealed everything I was inside. I couldn't see my clothes. I couldn't see my body. But I felt every thought, every memory, and every intention being exposed as if projected before me with total clarity. There was no sound, no announcement, and yet I knew with a certainty that didn't come from reason, but from the soul, that I was before Jesus. His presence didn't convey anger or coldness, but a truth so immense that no justification could withstand it. When he looked at me, I felt that all the sins I had tried to forget were visible, not through words, but through my own conscience. Then, without raising his voice, he confronted me with just one question that pierced everything I believed myself to be. Where were you when they cried out for help? And when he revealed the pain I had caused, I realized that it wasn't him who was judging me. It was me. When Jesus' gaze met mine, the reality around me ceased to exist as an external backdrop and became an internal revelation, as if he had opened a door I had spent my entire life trying to keep locked. It wasn't just a memory. It wasn't a kind of film playing before me. It was lived experience. The pain of those I had harmed pierced my soul, as if every repressed emotion materialized within me. And I felt the despair of a mother trying to protect her children while sensing that nothing can stop the approaching invasion. I felt the silent humiliation of a man trying to negotiate his own dignity in a desperate attempt to preserve his family's life. And I felt the stifled panic of a child watching everything hidden behind a door, trying to understand why violence had chosen that particular home. Every sensation, every emotion, every fear that I had always seen only as part of the operation began to settle within me with an intensity I never knew existed, as if the tears I had ignored were burning my conscience. Jesus didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to accuse, because the light emanating from him allowed me to see myself without masks. And when I finally saw who I had become, I understood that hell is not a place reserved for visible monsters, but a natural consequence of those who spend their lives choosing to ignore love and stifle their own conscience. The light began to recede, and for the first time, I experienced the true meaning of his absence, a void so profound that it seemed to tear pieces from my existence, not with violence, but with the crushing pain of realizing that nothing else could fill that space. Jesus' voice then broke the silence, not as an accusation, but as absolute revelation, saying that I had not only participated in violence, I had interfered in the destiny of lives that God created with purpose. At that moment, I understood that hell is not punishment. It is the consequence of turning away from the light. And just when the darkness began to pull me in, I heard my name being called at the hospital, and life gave me one last chance. When my eyes opened in the hospital, it was as if the world was in slow motion. The bright white lights on the ceiling blinded me. The smell of alcohol and medication filled my nose, and for a few seconds I couldn't comprehend if I was alive or still trapped in that state between eternity and existence. I felt the weight of something cold around my wrist, and when I looked, I saw the handcuff fastening my hand to the bed frame. That marked my return to reality in a brutal way, as if God were telling me that even alive, I would have to face the consequences of the life I had chosen. A police officer was sitting beside the bed, but he didn't seem to look at me with hatred. It was as if he was seeing only another body wounded by its own destruction. However, when I tried to speak, my voice came out choked and fragile, breaking inside my throat as if I was swallowing shards of glass. It wasn't physical pain. It was the weight of conscience, something I had never felt before. The nurse noticed my desperation and asked if I needed water. I nodded, and when she approached, I couldn't hold back my tears. I was crying not because of the accident, not because of the imprisonment, but because the presence of Jesus had left me during that experience, and comparing what I had felt with the emptiness that followed, I realized that no earthly punishment would be worse than living separated from the one who is life itself. Tears streamed down my face without me trying to hide them, and I kept repeating to myself that I wasn't worthy of having been brought back. When I finally managed to speak, I asked to speak with a chaplain. I didn't want to negotiate with God. I didn't want to bargain, I wanted to confess. When the pastor entered the room, I broke down, recounting everything I had done, without softening anything, as if each word were a stone being lifted from the weight I carried in my chest. He didn't interrupt me, he just listened, and when I finished, he put his hand on my shoulder and said that repentance wasn't just feeling guilty, but allowing God to rebuild what I had destroyed inside. I knew I couldn't bring back the lives that had been taken, but I could offer mine so that God could transform the rest of my days into something that honored the chance he had given me. In that hospital bed, handcuffed like a criminal, I found freedom for the first time. I had nothing left to offer, except my surrender. And then I understood. Being saved wasn't about God freeing me from prison. It was about God taking me out of what was holding me captive inside. After everything I've been through, after seeing what no one sees while still alive, I understood something that would completely change how I see life and eternity. I realized that no one deceives God. Not with silence, not with excuses, not with masks. We spend our whole lives trying to build edited versions of ourselves. Versions we show to family, to friends, to society, and even versions we show ourselves when we want to escape the truth. But before God, there is no image editing, no narrative, no justification. Before God, there is only truth, and this truth is not expressed in words. It is expressed in who you really are when no one is watching. I discovered too late that hell is not about fire, it's about absence. It's not about punishment, it's about harvest. It's not about God punishing, it's about man choosing to live far from him until there is no return. If there's something in your life that you know is wrong, don't wait for God to take everything away from you to open your eyes. I had to die to see my own life. Don't wait for pain to seek change. Don't wait to lose everything to realize that nothing in this world is worth more than the presence of God. It's not crime that destroys a person, it's indifference to one's own sin. The worst prison isn't made of iron bars. It's made of habits that distance us from God every day, little by little, until we wake up spiritually dead, even while walking and breathing. There's only one person capable of preventing your fall. You. by making the decision today to stop playing with things that are killing your soul. I was saved physically, but what truly saved me was Jesus reaching my soul when I had already given up on myself. You don't need to go through what I went through to understand what I'm saying now. If you feel that God is speaking to you through this story, don't ignore it. Write in the comments, "Lord, change my life before life breaks me." If this video touched you, subscribe to the channel now, so that more testimonies like this can reach people who need to hear God's voice before it's too late.